What if I told you that 9 experienced hikers died in the Russian mountains under circumstances so bizarre that the Soviet government sealed the case files for decades? And when they were finally opened, the explanations became even more disturbing than the mystery itself. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, and what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most chilling unsolved mysteries. On February 2nd, 1959, 9 Soviet students embarked on what should have been a routine skiing expedition through the Ural Mountains. But something went catastrophically wrong on the slopes of Kolet-Shachel, a mountain whose name translates to Dead Mountain in the local Mansai language. And when search parties finally discovered their camp 3 weeks later, what they found defied all logical explanation. The tent was sliced open from the inside, as if the experienced hikers had frantically cut their way out in absolute terror, fleeing into the brutal Siberian night wearing nothing but underwear and socks in temperatures that plunged to negative 30 degrees Celsius. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The bodies were found scattered across the mountainside, some nearly a mile from the tent, and the autopsy reports revealed injuries so severe that the medical examiner compared them to victims of a high-speed car crash. Yet there were no external wounds, no signs of a struggle, and no explanation for what could have caused such catastrophic internal damage. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, officially closed the case, citing death by a compelling natural force, a conclusion so vague and unsatisfying that it sparked 60 years of speculation, conspiracy theories, and desperate searches for the truth. Were they killed by a secret Soviet military test? Did they encounter something paranormal on that frozen mountainside? Or is the truth somehow even stranger than any theory we've imagined? The story begins in January 1959, when Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, assembled a group of 9 experienced hikers for an expedition that would earn them the highest certification in Soviet mountaineering, a grade 3 hike that required traversing over 300 kilometers through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the Soviet Union. The group consisted of Dyatlov himself, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Nikolai Thibault-Grignot, Semyon Zolotaryov, and initially a 10th member, Yuri Yudin, who would become the only survivor simply because he fell ill and turned back before the group reached the fateful mountain. On January 27th, the group arrived at Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before the wilderness, and the next day they began their trek into the northern Ural Mountains. And according to Dyatlov's meticulously kept journal, everything proceeded normally for the first few days as they made steady progress through the snowy landscape. By February 1st, they had reached the edge of a highland area and began preparing for the most difficult part of their journey, the climb up the slope of Kolet-Shachel. But instead of setting up camp in the safety of a nearby forest, they made a decision that would later baffle investigators. They pitched their tent on the exposed mountainside, vulnerable to the harsh winds and brutal cold. That night, something happened that triggered such overwhelming terror that all 9 hikers simultaneously made the fatal decision to flee their only shelter, slicing through the tent's fabric in their desperation to escape, running barefoot and half-dressed into a deadly winter night. And whatever they were running from, they feared it more than the certainty of freezing to death. When the group failed to return to Vizhai by their scheduled date of February 12th, there was initial concern but not immediate alarm, as delays in such expeditions were common. But when days passed with no word, the families pressured the Institute to launch a search operation. On February 20th, volunteer search teams were organized, and on February 26th, the first searchers reached the abandoned campsite, and what they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The tent was half torn down and covered with snow, but it was still standing and filled with the group's belongings. Their boots, warm clothes, and supplies all left behind, and the tent fabric had been cut open from the inside with long, deliberate slashes. indicating the hikers had intentionally destroyed their only shelter to escape. Footprints leading away from the tent told an even more disturbing story. Investigators found 8 or 9 sets of prints, some barefoot, some in socks, some in a single boot, all heading down the slope toward the tree line. And the prints showed a walking pace, not running, suggesting the hikers weren't fleeing in blind panic, but were moving with purpose away from something at the tent. The prints were visible for several hundred meters before the wind and snow obscured them, but searchers followed their trajectory and made the first grim discovery near the forest edge. About 1.5 kilometers from the tent, the bodies of Yuri Krivonyshenko and Yuri Doroshenko found lying near the remains of a small fire. Both wearing only underwear, both frozen to death, and bizarrely, both showing signs of having tried to climb a large cedar tree with broken branches up to 5 meters high, as if they were trying to see something back toward the tent or escape from something below. But what could make experienced mountaineers climb a tree in freezing conditions wearing almost nothing? The next 3 bodies were found over the following days, spaced out on the slope between the cedar tree and the tent, frozen in positions suggesting they had been trying to crawl back to camp. Dyatlov himself was found 300 meters from the cedar, Kolmogorova 630 meters away, and Slobodin 480 meters from the tent, and all 3 had died of hypothermia, their faces peaceful, their bodies showing minor injuries but nothing that would explain their bizarre behavior. The real mystery, however, was just beginning, because 4 members of the group were still missing, and it would take another 2 months before the final, most disturbing discoveries were made. On May 4th, searchers found the remaining 4 bodies under 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters from the cedar tree. And unlike the first 5 victims who died of cold exposure, these 4 showed signs of massive trauma that would change the entire complexion of the investigation. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had major skull damage. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had major chest fractures, and Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue, while Zolotaryov was missing his eyes. The medical examiner, Boris Vozrozdeny, stated in his report that the force required to cause the chest fractures was extremely high, and compared it to a car crash, noting that there were no corresponding external injuries, no bruises or skin damage, just catastrophic internal trauma, as if they had been subjected to an enormous uniform pressure. Even more puzzling, these 4 bodies were found wearing clothes that belonged to the other victims, suggesting the survivors had scavenged clothing from their dead friends in a desperate attempt to stay warm, and some of these clothes showed traces of high levels of radiation, though this detail wouldn't be revealed for decades. The official investigation, led by prosecutor Lev Ivanov, interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined the scene, reviewed the autopsy reports, and ultimately concluded absolutely nothing of substance, closing the case in May 1959 with the bizarre determination that the hikers died from a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome, a phrase so deliberately vague it spawned countless theories. Ivanov himself, in interviews given decades later before his death, admitted that he had been pressured to shut down the investigation by Soviet authorities and hinted that he believed something extraordinary had occurred on the mountain, something that the government wanted to keep hidden. Local Mansi people reported seeing strange orange spheres floating in the sky around the time of the incident. And interestingly, other hiking groups in the area that same night reported seeing similar lights. And there were also military reports of similar phenomena, leading to speculation about secret weapons tests, though no evidence of such tests has ever been conclusively proven. The radiation found on some clothing items has fueled theories ranging from Soviet nuclear experiments to encounters with extraterrestrial craft. But skeptics point out that some of the hikers worked in nuclear facilities and could have been exposed to low-level radiation in their daily work. One of the most popular theories suggests that the hikers were victims of a Soviet military test, possibly involving parachute mines, radiological weapons, or thermobaric devices that were being secretly developed in the area. And proponents of this theory point to the government's swift sealing of the area, the pressure to close the investigation, and the intense internal trauma without external wounds, as evidence of a weapons-related incident. However, critics argue that there's no evidence of a blast wave, no residue from explosives, and no rational reason why the military would test weapons on a route they knew civilian hikers were traveling. Another compelling theory involves infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can't be heard by humans, but can cause feelings of intense dread, panic, nausea, and even physical vibrations in body tissue. Under certain weather conditions, wind passing over mountain formations can create standing waves of infrasound, and experiments have shown that exposure to specific frequencies can induce terror and irrational behavior in humans. Could such a phenomenon have driven the hikers mad with fear, causing them to flee their tent and make fatal decisions while in a state of panic-induced delirium? This theory would explain the seemingly purposeful but ultimately irrational behavior, the lack of external injuries initially, and the bizarre decision to flee into deadly cold. But it doesn't easily account for the severe trauma found on the final 4 bodies or the missing soft tissues. The avalanche theory has been proposed and debunked multiple times over the decades, with critics noting that the slope wasn't steep enough for a typical avalanche, there was no evidence of avalanche debris, and the tent was still standing. But in 2021, a new study published in Nature Communications by Swiss researchers used advanced computer modeling to suggest that a small, delayed slab avalanche could have struck the tent hours after it was pitched, causing internal injuries but leaving the tent relatively intact. According to this theory, the hikers cut their way out and retreated to the forest, intending to wait until it was safe to return, but in the brutal cold and darkness, they succumbed to hypothermia before they could recover their supplies. While this scientific approach provides a rational explanation, it still leaves haunting questions unanswered. Why did experienced mountaineers camp on an exposed slope? What caused the specific pattern of injuries? How do we explain the missing tongue and eyes, the scavenged clothing, the attempts to climb the tree, and the reports of strange lights? Some researchers have proposed that the hikers encountered hostile individuals, perhaps military personnel guarding a secret facility, escaped prisoners from a nearby gulag, or even hostile Mansi hunters. But this theory crumbles under scrutiny because the autopsy found no defensive wounds, no signs of combat, and the Mansi themselves were known to avoid the dead mountain and had no motive to harm the students. The paradoxical undressing, a well-documented phenomenon in severe hypothermia where victims remove their clothing due to a malfunction in their brain's ability to regulate temperature perception, explains why some bodies were found nearly naked, but it doesn't explain why they left the tent that way in the first place, or the massive trauma injuries. In recent years, access to previously classified documents has provided some new information, but has also deepened certain mysteries. Files released in the 1990s revealed that another hiking group in the region around the same time reported that a member of their party had been badly injured by what they described as a bright flying sphere, though details are scarce and the veracity is questionable. More credible are the military documents confirming that the Soviet military was indeed conducting tests in the general region, though not necessarily on the specific mountain or at that exact time. In 2019, on the 60th anniversary of the incident, Russian authorities reopened the investigation, examining 3 possible causes: an avalanche, a snow slab, or a hurricane-force wind event. In 2020, they officially concluded that a small avalanche was responsible, a determination that satisfied virtually no one familiar with the case's intricate details. Survivors' families and independent researchers continue to dispute this conclusion, pointing to the many aspects of the case that remain unexplained by such a simple scenario. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor who had turned back due to illness, spent the rest of his life haunted by the loss of his friends and searching for answers, giving numerous interviews and studying the evidence until his death in 2013, and he never accepted the official explanations, believing that something truly unusual had occurred on that mountain. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Dyatlov Pass incident isn't the mystery of what happened, but the pattern of how the victims behaved. They left safety, they walked calmly into certain death, they performed seemingly purposeful actions like building a fire and climbing a tree. They scavenged clothes from the dead, and yet they never returned to the tent where survival gear waited just a kilometer away. This suggests they believed something at or near the tent was more dangerous than freezing to death, a threat so persistent and terrifying that returning was not an option, even as their friends died around them in the brutal cold. What could inspire such conviction? What could 9 rational, experienced outdoors people have witnessed or experienced that overrode their survival instincts so completely? Some have suggested a chemical exposure that caused hallucinations and irrational behavior, possibly from a weapons test or industrial accident upwind of their camp. But no toxicology reports from the autopsies indicated poisoning, though such testing in 1959 was far less sophisticated than today's standards. The psychological theory of group panic suggests that one person's fear can cascade through a group, causing collective, irrational behavior. And in the dark, cold, and disorienting environment, an initial panic from an ambiguous threat could have spiraled into the fatal decisions we see in the evidence. But what triggered that initial panic? Recent expeditions to the site have found no unusual geological features, no hidden military installations, no evidence of anything that would explain the events of February 1959. The tent's location has been precisely identified, the route reconstructed, the weather conditions analyzed, and yet the mountain keeps its secrets. What makes this case enduringly fascinating isn't just the mystery, but the quality of the evidence. We have photographs from the hikers' cameras showing happy, confident people enjoying their expedition right up until the last day. We have detailed diaries and documentation of their route. We have autopsy reports, investigation files, and physical evidence, and yet none of it assembles into a coherent narrative that explains everything. Each theory solves some pieces of the puzzle while leaving others mysteriously unaccounted for. The human mind craves resolution, seeks patterns and explanations, and the Dyatlov Pass incident frustrates this need perfectly, presenting us with facts that seem to describe an impossible event. Could it be that multiple factors combined in a perfect storm of tragedy? Perhaps infrasound or unusual weather created initial panic, causing the tent evacuation. Perhaps a subsequent avalanche or snow event injured some victims. Perhaps hypothermia and paradoxical undressing explain the state of the bodies. Perhaps animal scavenging accounts for the missing soft tissues. This multi-factor theory is perhaps the most realistic, acknowledging that not every mystery has a single dramatic explanation, that sometimes tragedy results from a cascade of unfortunate circumstances, rather than one spectacular cause. But even this practical approach leaves threads hanging. The military pressure to close the investigation, the reports of strange lights, the radiation traces, the specific decision to camp on an exposed slope, the broken tree branches 5 meters high. These details whisper of something more, something unusual, something that doesn't fit neatly into conventional explanations. As we examine this case decades later, with the benefit of modern forensic science, computer modeling, and access to previously sealed files, we find ourselves no closer to absolute certainty than the first investigators who stood on that snowy slope in 1959, looking at the slashed tent and the footprints leading into oblivion. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains a perfect mystery, a historical Rorschach test where everyone sees the reflection of their own beliefs. Skeptics see natural phenomena and rational explanations. Conspiracy theorists see government cover-ups and secret weapons. Paranormal enthusiasts see evidence of the unexplained and perhaps unexplainable. The truth, whatever it is, lies buried in the snow of Dead Mountain, in the classified files of the Soviet military, in the last terrified moments of 9 young people who ran from their tent into the darkness and never came back. What did they see? What did they fear more than freezing to death? What could have caused injuries comparable to a car crash without leaving external marks? Why did the Soviet government seal the investigation? Why was the area closed to hikers for 3 years following the incident? These questions have echoed through 6 decades, spawning books, documentaries, movies, and countless investigations, yet Dead Mountain guards its secret still. The Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a reminder that even in our modern age of science and surveillance, some mysteries resist solution, some questions remain unanswered, and some stories end without resolution. 9 people walked into the Ural Mountains in January 1959, and something on the slopes of Kholat Shachel terrified them so profoundly that they chose certain death over facing it. Until we know what that something was, the Dyatlov Pass incident will continue to haunt our imagination. A cold case in every sense, frozen in time like the bodies of its victims, waiting for the truth to finally, perhaps impossibly, be revealed,